What I did for Nas probably never been done for him in his life. He's never been that viral at all, ever. Ever. He's never been talked about like this ever in his life. This is a fact, Jack. You heard? If not, they would have stood up a long time ago and hollered at me, you dig? But this is where I'm at with it. My competitive nature brings me here.
It was me and you. There were about 20 of them. And I didn't know it was him. We just walked by into the hotel, and Mike started laughing. I said, why? He said, seen your man put his head down? I said, who? He said, Jim Jones. I said, no. So he's like, yeah. I said, oh, whatever. So it's just me and him, you know, no security, nothing, just. So, and on a DVD a few months later, I heard that he said, he saw me and said, Nasir Jones, what up? And he said, I had a bunch of bodyguards and I had my head down. I said, why even acknowledge that you saw me? It don't even fucking make no damn sense, nigga. Like, if you put your head down or you didn't see me, you don't want, why even say it on a DVD, nigga?
Nas is regarded as one of the most poetic rappers of all time. Ever since he was 19 years old, he's been looked at as one of the greats. Ever since he put out Illmatic, he put the whole rap game on notice. Looking at all of Nas's albums from Illmatic to Stillmatic, there are a couple of songs that make you start thinking. Most of Nas's songs is not for the mainstream audience. His style is more poetic, sociological, and spiritual. On Illmatic, there's songs like Memory Lane and Life's a Bitch. Two songs detailing the harsh realities Nas had to grow up in, losing friends, doing what it takes to survive, and navigate the dangerous environment he once lived in. When they're young, growing up in the projects, low-income communities, neighborhoods, basically the hood, your worldview on life changes drastically. Nas expanded further with his second album, It Was Written, which was released in '96. Now, on this album, there are a bunch of songs that make you start thinking and dive even further at what Nas is really trying to say. I Gave You Power is one of the most recognized songs on that album and in Nas' catalog. Nas raps from the perspective of a gun, describing its encounters with various owners to illustrate how it feels to be abused and accountable for the destruction it inflicts. The story explores the psychological and physical harm caused by firearms while considering the effects of gun violence on local communities. There is another song on this album and is one of my favorites called Black Girl Lost. Nas narrates the tale of a girl who got lost. He thinks that this girl, who was once pure, has turned bad by doing drugs, using drugs, drinking alcohol, sleeping around, and other things. Nas has always had a bunch of songs that were always for the mind and barely has songs that was for the clubs, the radio, or for it to be commercially successful. I Am and Nostradamus were super commercial albums, and yes, there are some introspective songs on there as well, but the main album and component for this video, and my favorite Nas's album, Stillmatic, is the album of the video. Stillmatic is one of hip-hop's most significant creative revivals that occurred in 2001. Nas returned with Stillmatic, an album that would not only restore his lyrical domination, but also solidify his position as rap's most respected street observer, following industry skepticism and criticism of his late 1990s production. High-profile events and competitive spirit dominated the headlines, but one record, Second Childhood, stands out solely as a masterwork of psychological narrative. The song, which was produced by DJ Premier and features a stunningly simple boom-bap background, forgoes spectacle in favor for introspection. No club aspirations, no gaudy hooks, no attempts at commercial appeal. Nas presents a sociological portrayal of adulthood plagued by unresolved youth, which is significantly more potent. Second Childhood dives deeply into the topic of halted development, which is rarely explored in hip-hop. Through a striking number of character studies, Nas exposes people caught in vicious cycles of trauma, ego, emotional immaturity, and nostalgia. Rather than being villains, these are identifiable individuals whose development was disrupted by their surroundings, sense of self, pride, or unresolved sorrow. Nas' viewpoint is what makes the record so brilliant. He examines these people rather than his passing judgment. In this dual roles as narrator and local historian, he chronicles how childhood fears can resurface in different ways as an adult. The song starts to focus more on universal truth, getting older is unavoidable, but growing up necessitates purposeful evolution rather than on personal tales. Second Childhood serves as an introspective moment in Stillmatic's larger story, a transitional period between struggle and victory where maturity takes center stage. Along with reflecting the lives of the personas Nas writes about, it also shows how he developed as a storyteller and reached a new level of self-awareness. Even after more than 20 years, the song is still timeless. It speaks to anybody negotiating identity, memory, and the challenging process of emotional development since its theme cut across time, place, and gender. Second Childhood defines confection in a genre that frequently emphasizes survival and proceeds by exploring something more profound, the psychology of stasis and the silent battle to grow up. The composition, narrative structure, psychological themes, cultural background, and lasting importance of Nas' second child are all examined in this documentary, which turns the song into one of hip-hop's most profound meditations on maturity. Because the most significant conflicts aren't often fought in the headlines, charts, or streets. There are sometimes internal conflicts. Nas depicts people who are physically maturing but emotionally immobile through the vivid storytelling and nuanced societal commentary. These people include adults who are reliving their adolescent desires, seeking acceptance from the past, and repeating behaviors that keep them trapped in a never-ending cycle of youth. An examination of the ways in which the environment, trauma, pride, and survival mentality can impede emotional development, particularly in societies where maturity can be perceived as betrayal and vulnerability as weakness. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of second childhood is that Nas isn't merely describing other people. He is speaking of all of us, because every adult has a younger version inside of them that is still searching for approval, dealing with insecurity, and picking up lessons that time cannot impart. This is a tale of a song that examined human evolution. Street observations were turned into psychological insight by this record, and a work of art that posed that eerie question: what if growing older doesn't mean growing up? Second childhood is this. The phrase second childhood is far older than hip-hop. Its origins trace back to classical literature and early Western philosophy, where human life was often described in stages. One of the most famous references appear in William Shakespeare's As You Like It in 1599. In the Seven Ages of Man monologue, Shakespeare describes the final stage of life as second childhoodness and mere oblivion. Here, second childhood referred to elderly people returning to a state of dependency, physically weak, forgetful, and childlike again. It was associated with aging, decline, and cognitive regression. Throughout history, the second childhood stereotype has persisted and been expressed in a wide range of literary works from ancient to modern times. The humoral theory of aging, dementia, the perceived and real need of older adults in care, and the other connection between childhood and old age were cited as explanations for this stereotype. It was also believed that the second childhood was a time when the life cycle started over. So in this context, the person is going from a child to an adult to back to acting like a child. The concept was then linked to theories of regression in psychology, which postulate that when people are under stress or trauma, they revert to earlier developmental habits as a protective mechanism. Here's where Nas' brilliance lies. Though he completely reframes the term, he applies it to young and middle-aged persons rather than the elderly, not because they're getting older, but because they're never truly matured. They never had any real responsibilities in life. They coast their whole entire life, so when it's actually time to be an adult and do all those things, they lack the proper skills and comprehension to get those things done. They go back to the comfort zone and get back to being a kid. That's why if you live in the hood, you always see an old head still hanging around the block, the youngins smoking, drinking, and having the time of their life, when in reality, that old head doesn't have his own crib, no 401k, no life insurance, no job, no money saved up, nothing. Survival skills are more valued more highly than emotional growth in many metropolitan societies, particularly in those that have been influenced by poverty, structural pressure, and violence. Being a man turns into armor, ego turns into defense, nostalgia turns into escape. Growth also seems risky because vulnerability is necessary for progress. Nas' second childhood has nothing to do with stupidity. It has to do with fear, fear of being irrelevant, a fear of becoming someone else, fear of facing suffering. People withdraw into the most comfortable version of themselves, which is frequently the one they develop during adolescence, rather than changing. There's also a layer that is unique to hip-hop. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, youth, power, and notoriety were highly valued in rap culture. In hip-hop, aging was and frequently still is viewed as a sign of decline. Identity had to be redefined in order to age gracefully. A few artists modified, others held on to earlier incarcerations of themselves. Second childhood quietly challenges that societal norm. In essence, Nas is asking, what happens when immaturity is rewarded on the streets? When growth appears to be weakness, what happens? What occurs when one identity is bound up with a past that no longer exists? In the next part of this video, we're going to be analyzing the verses from the song because they're all compacted with scenarios and people we actually might know and see in real life in our neighborhoods. So in the first verse of the song, Nas is detailing what he saw, felt, heard, all in his neighborhood. He's reminiscing on his life before he became a rapper, before Illmatic, before he was Nasty Nas. Despite the crime and violence surrounding the neighborhood, Nas was still able to depict what he actually enjoyed from youth. He remembered watching Godzilla, his dad smoking, hearing the police sirens all around the block. He took it all in. Aggression, the presence of police, death, anarchy, and he internalized it rather than folding it. Here's the secret though. He claimed that the man was influenced by his early years. He is therefore speaking from actual experiences rather than superiority when he later criticizes others for being mired in their youth. With a tone that combined nostalgia and realism, Nas revisits his early years in Queensbridge, contrasting harmless kid imagery, television monsters, riddles, humor, and curiosity with the glaring intrusion of neighborhood violence, police raids, and early exposure to death. This contrast demonstrates how the environment in underprivileged groups compresses puberty, making children absorb survival instincts before emotional maturity may emerge organically. The roll call of local leaders functions similarly to an archival record, highlighting how memory creates identity while reaffirming Nas's function as a historian. Crucially, he does not romanticize adversity. Rather, he demonstrates how early exposure to disorder fostered his fearlessness and keen observation traits that ultimately drove his artistic output. When he claims to be in his second childhood, that statement takes on multiple meanings. It implies conscious reclamation rather than regression, a return to curiosity and creative hunger as opposed to a retreat into immaturity. Nas returns to youthful awareness, using reflection as development rather than escape, in contrast to the song's later characters who are ensnared in nostalgia or ego. The song is positioned as a mediation on whether we are captive to our early environments or capable of transforming them into wisdom. The verse thus reframes childhood as both wound and resource, saying that growth is not about rejecting one's history but rather comprehending it. The second verse to Second Childhood is likely the structural and thematic focal point of the entire album, since its shift from autobiography to diagnosis, turning the song from introspective memoir to social critique. In this instance, Nas portrays a man who has permitted his street persona to solidify his perpetual adolescence, a person who continues to gauge his value by power, reputation, and conflict long after the situations that necessitated such actions have passed. This verse is important because it reveals how, in some contexts, masculinity becomes immobile at the survival stage. Characteristics that once guaranteed safety, such as hypervigilance, violence, pride, and a refusal to display vulnerability, transform into emotional constraints when development necessitates adaptation. Nas portrays a character with unnerving realism rather than satire, demonstrating how fear of becoming irrelevant and longing for one's past dominance can keep a person stuck in a vicious cycle. In terms of psychology, the verse examines the defense mechanism of ego preservation. If a man's greatest status was derived from street approbation when he was younger, then becoming quieter or more reflective may feel like giving up. It criticizes how societies can promote inertia, mistaking maturity for frailty, and irresponsibility for sincerity. This verse is crucial to the song's structure since it immediately contrasts with Nas's own development, which was established in the first verse. While Nas returns to childhood to better understand himself, this character relives adolescence to avoid facing change. This conflict between introspection and regression serves as the moral compass of the song. Without this line, second childhood will only be a sentimental memory. With it, the song becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when a survival mindset outlives its necessity. At this point, Nas focuses on himself and begins reflecting back on society, transforming the song from a personal to a communal one and making it one of Stillmatic's most psychologically insightful songs. The third verse of this song is also crucial as well because it transforms the song from a critique of male ego into a broad examination of emotional immaturity across gender and lifestyle. Here, Nas paints a portrait of a 27-year-old woman trapped in adolescent behavior, socially active, image-conscious, impulsive, and driven by external validation rather than stability. The repeated emphasis on partying, name-dropping, designer brands, and nightlife culture highlights a life built around performance rather than progress. Financial instability contrasts sharply with the illusion of success, reinforcing the theme of fronting as a defense mechanism, projecting adulthood while emotionally remaining 12. The verse's silent sadness over a child is its most terrible aspect. The metaphor that places her as the earth and her son as the sun emphasizes the natural order of responsibilities but her incapacity to grow up disrupts that circle. Psychologically, Nas is dissecting avoidance, avoiding accountability, avoiding growth, avoiding self-reflection. Her constant friend changes and unfinished education symbolize instability and stalled development, while arguments and selfishness suggest unresolved insecurity masquerading as confidence. Structurally, this verse is essential because it completes the song's thesis. Arrested development is not limited to street masculinity. It can manifest through romantic chaos, consumerism, and social image fixation. By the song ending here, Nas widens the lens from individual flaws to a cultural pattern, showing how some adults continue to perform in adolescence long after has time moved on. The final line lands not as mockery, but as diagnosis. She isn't evil, she's stuck. And that stuckness is a true subject of second childhood. While discussing the second childhood legacy, it's important to understand that its cultural impact was not loud, it was lasting. Released on Stillmatic during one of the most highly profiled moments of Nas's career, the song lived in the shadow of headline-grabbing records. Yet over time, it became one of the album's most respected deep cuts, a benchmark for introspective street storytelling. In 2001, hip-hop was shifting. Commercial rap was becoming flashier, more image-driven, more celebratory. Street records were often centered on dominance, wealth, and competition. In that climate, Nas choosing to dissect emotion and maturity in men and women was culturally bold. He wasn't glorifying dysfunction, he was diagnosing it. That positioned him differently from many of his contemporaries. Where others amplified bravado, Nas introduced psychological realism. This song also reinforces Nas' reputation as hip-hop's premier neighborhood documentarian. Ever since he put out Illmatic, he had been known for observational storytelling, but Second Childhood matured that lens. Instead of just describing street life, he examined the long-term psychological consequences of it. That shift influenced a generation of artists who began learning deeper into introspection rather than pure repertoire. Culturally, the phrase second childhood took on a new meaning within hip-hop circles. Traditionally associated with aging or regression, Nas reframed it as both warning and mirror, a metaphor for adults repeating adolescent patterns. Fans connected to it because the characters weren't exaggerated archetypes. They were recognizable figures in every borough, every city, every neighborhood. The man stuck on a past glory, the woman stuck in nightlife cycles, the adult who never emotionally transitioned. The record also strengthened the artistic partnership between Nas and DJ Premier, reminding listeners of Boom Bap's ability to carry layered social commentary without relying on radio formulas. At a time when glossy production was becoming dominant, Second Childhood proved that minimalism and storytelling still had power. Over the years, the song's impact has grown with age. As listeners themselves matured, its themes hit harder. What may have sounded like a commentary at 18 feels like reflection at 30. That's cultural longevity. It's not a song you outgrow. It's a song that grows with you. Ultimately, Second Childhood didn't change the charts, it changed conversation. It expanded what street rap could examine. It showed that toughness and vulnerability could coexist in the same narrative. And in doing so, it cemented its place as one of the most psychologically insightful records in Nas's catalog, a quiet classic whose influence lives not in the hype, but in depth. In a catalog filled with cultural landmarks, lyrical showcases, and historic moments, Second Childhood stands as one of Nas's most understated achievements, not because it lacks power, but because its power is internal. It isn't about shout, it's not about provoking the headlines, it's not about chasing radio. Instead, it does something far rarer. It holds up a mirror. On Stillmatic, an album often remembered for confrontation and redemption like songs Ether and Got Yourself a Gun, Second Childhood represents reflection. While other records assert dominance, this one examines vulnerability. While others battle opponents, this one battles stagnation. It is Nas at his most observant, less concerned with proving he's the greatest and more concerned with understanding why people fail to grow. What makes a song a quiet masterpiece is its balance of empathy and critique. The characters aren't villains, they're recognizable. The man stuck in teenage glory, the woman trapped in validation cycles, the adults repeating adolescent patterns. Nas doesn't condemn them, he contextualizes them. He understands that environment, trauma, pride, and fear all contribute to emotional arrest. But he also makes something clear. Awareness is a first step toward evolution. And that's where the title becomes profound. A second childhood can mean regression, a retreat into immaturity, but it can also mean rebirth, a conscious return to curiosity, creativity, and self-examination. Nas positions himself in the latter category. He revisits his youth not to relive it, but to understand it. That distinction separates growth from repetition. You begin to see the patterns, you recognize the cycles, you confront your own tendencies towards nostalgia or ego preservation. The record evolves alongside you, and few songs accomplish that. Ultimately, Second Childhood is a masterclass in mature storytelling. It proves that hip-hop can be psychological without losing its edge, reflective without losing authenticity, critical without losing compassion. It's not the loudest moment in Nas' career, but it may be one of the wisest, because sometimes greatness isn't measured by controversy or chart position. Sometimes it's measured by how honestly and raw this captures the human condition and how long that truth continues to echo. Alright, that's the end of the video. I love you, no pause. Alright, water.